So we're going to start off with Melissa Duarte, who is a perfusionist at New York Presbyterian. And she's also the co-founder and co-host of On Pump, it's a perfusion podcast with Tiffany Van Dyke. And so all together, we're going to jump into the DeLorean as she goes back to the future and tells us what we've got to look forward to and what we have looked forward to in the past. Melissa.
Thank you guys for the opportunity to present today. This is Back to the Future, Perfusion's Centennial nod to its Quinquagenary. I have no disclosures. So the year is 2075. Perfusion has gathered to celebrate its centennial and the advancements of our profession in its first 100 years. Most surprising to us all is the resurgence of past literature long forgotten in the quest of descendant generations to forge their own path and question the status quo to push clinical practice forward. Most unexpected is the taste of familiarity senior perfusionists have when meeting the new generation's 20% who remind them of somebody they knew long ago. The Pareto principle has long established that 80% of results are created by 20% of individuals. We are able to travel time by traveling various centers. Stepping into the future is an adventure only some centers will dare to do. Led by divergent thinkers, they will recruit and seek out individuals who push the boundaries of perfusion. From those centers, prolific research, future leaders, modern circuitry, new devices will come at a speed unthinkable. But the keys to that kingdom will not rest with the new generation. They are kept by the giants who see the spark of genius in the young and hungry and help clear their path. Before we get going, I wanted to take a moment to look at a couple of individuals who helped shape my perspective on what the future will look like. The first is Bennett A. Mitchell. He's one of the first perfusionists in our field, and yet he is hard to find in a perfusion textbook. He was one of the first to perform hypothermic perfusion for an ASC repair. He modified and built one of the first heart-lung machines in experimental surgeries. He operated the heart-lung machine on the first clinical case at Cornell Medical Center in 1956. He built his own prototype oxygenator called the Mitchell oxygenator. He is known for coining the term perfusionist, and he helped stimulate the creation of AMSECT. We would not be here today without people like Bennett A. Mitchell in the field. And then we have another individual, Charles Reed, who couldn't be more different than Bennett Mitchell. Bennett Mitchell was described as a charismatic, happy individual who was highly intelligent. He traveled the world and spoke to many perfusionists and taught across various countries. He was quiet, but he made great advancements. Charles Reed was described as charismatic, passionate, forthright, and focused, and absolutely uncompromising in his pursuit of excellence. We're looking at the man who decided to publish a white paper to manufacturers studying how much water leakage from heat exchangers to the blood phase was acceptable. Of course, every perfusionist here would agree that his conclusion in his paper, which said no amount of water leakage is acceptable, is correct. However, there was much pushback from manufacturers and from the industry. And in one paper, it was said to have happened that his surgeon looked at him and said, "You probably shouldn't have done that." I'm not sure how many perfusionists hear things like that anymore today. But he was recruited by Denton Cooley for being one of the innovators who pushed the field forward. And Denton Cooley saw in Charles Reed somebody who would build the mecca of perfusion in Texas. Charles Reed always said, "Learn more than you need. Always observe what you're doing because you never know how much more you will have to do." But he also said, "Be more than you can be." So this is why we're here today. A giant is nothing without their mentor, and neither is anything without the right environment or platform. In the first 50 years in perfusion, a very rare few individuals blazed through life, demolishing obstacles, pushing boundaries, propelled by an insatiable drive to learn more, be more, and build. As with any new field, these individuals had to traverse long segments of their journeys alone, forging their own networks and seeking their own resources. limited by the resources of society. The next 50 years will be defined by the rise of the mentor, who believes in targeted recruitment of young innovators and gifts them a platform to experiment and continue to push our field forward. So it's my belief that we have a 2.5% of the population who thinks a little differently than the rest of us. And they like to tinker and they like to break things. And sometimes they don't know how to put it back together, but that's okay. They learn how. And sometimes they rebuild it better. And then you have the group of people who validate these individuals. These are your leaders, your early adopters. Without the early adopters, that individual is simply a tinkerer. But with your early adopters, the validation of these ideas become the advancements of tomorrow. So the future academic medical center will rise. We will find chiefs and directors of perfusion who find the value in taking somebody who thinks differently, pushes back, and maybe doesn't follow all your protocols, but in a safe way, right? So back in the early days, we used to experiment in vivo on humans in the operating room, and many times it didn't work. That's unacceptable today. Sentinel events are unacceptable today. Performance must be perfect. So we need an environment where people can tinker safely, which is the rise of the simulation laboratory that we have today. But these future academic medical centers, for the very few who dare to take on this idea, you will find your industry reps frequently coming. You will be the Mecca where they bring their device and you say, this doesn't work. We need to change this. How about we do it this way? How about you look at it a little differently? And those places will be the ones who help refine the ideas of industry and manufacturers. There will also be a space at the Academic Medical Center for a lot of research. You will have students who would want to come and learn from you. You will have visitors from across various countries who want to come in and see what you're doing, because what you're doing is not done anywhere else, but it's better. So here is where we look at how technology evolves and how the young, idealistic new generation views the world. We have an advancement and we have a peak of inflated expectation, just like every young child when they look at the world and want to blaze through it. And then they realize how much work it actually takes. And you have the trough of disillusionment. And that's when those children realize they're going to need some help. And they get to the slope of enlightenment where somebody shows them the way because they have done the way and they had to do it alone and they understand how difficult it is to do it alone. So these mentors will be instrumental in removing all of the roadblocks that it takes to help the visionary next generation produce the advancements for tomorrow, to help better patient care. So what does tomorrow look like? Well, we have the rise of AI, and perfusion can learn to harness it and make it useful for us. Machine learning and predictive algorithms can guide interventions. Perfusionists may not often understand how they know what's going on, and that's because we've been accustomed to being trained to look at various data points and process various patterns at the speed of light and determine what conclusion is going to happen. We can teach computers to do the same thing. So if we took a heart-lung machine and patient data from various hospitals and we input more devices into the computer so that they had more data points, and we standardized how these data points are input into the computer, that avoids erroneous calculation. Once we have accurate calculations and data points, you can pair your computer with a centralized database with AI. That AI can then be taught how to look at the patterns you want them to look at. Once you teach AI how to look at the patterns that you want, they can chug out predictive analytics. These predictive analytics can help create practice change models. So if your AI tells you that every time surgeon X says sucker on and off, the perfusionist gets it wrong, it would take an individual a lot of time to get an IRB, to process that data, and to create that change. But if your AI was already gathering that in the background every single day, and at the end of the week, it spit out to the chief, hey, Surgeon X, when they say on versus off, it's not being registered correctly. Then that chief can say, okay, this needs to change. Why don't we change off to a different word? Why don't we say OF? So you can say on, but you have to say OF. And you do that. And then all that data from the next week chugs into your centralized database with your AI. And at the end of the week, your AI tells you there was 50% less error in communication this week at our center. That will then help you guide evidence-based practice guidelines. And once you have those, you inevitably change your practice again. And your AI is in the background as your workhorse. And it will plug out all of the conclusions from that change. And that is how you do continuous improvement in the new era. So the rise of the smart heart-lung machine. Could we have the future innovation? Spectrum's Quantum, I am not a sales rep for them, but their device seems to be one that is almost programmed in a way that can be useful for this. They have components that currently feed into their workstation. You can program that workstation to create visual and audio alerts for perfusionists when things are out of range. That's today. So today it'll tell you your arterial line pressure is too high or your PO2 is too low. But it's then up to the perfusionist to know the algorithm to diagnose whether or not you have an oxygenator failure. And there are various steps in that process that may not be useful to the perfusionist, but takes up time for them to do to get to the ultimate decision of what's going on their circuit. So what if your workstation was taught how to read patterns of data that are out of range when presented in groups? And when they did that, they could automatically start to assess in the background, alert the perfusionist, and remove the differential diagnoses that are improbable in that situation, and produce a streamlined suggestion or final step for the perfusionist to perform that can help resolve the problem 50% faster. This analysis undertaken by the AI is to improve its performance in assisting with crisis management the next time it can learn from this. And for those that think this might be far-fetched, your thermostats can now do this at home. Your thermostats now come with sensors that tell you when you're home and when you're not home, and they'll ramp up the temperature when you are home, and they'll turn it down when you're not home, and they save you money every month on your energy bill. So why can't our AI start to learn with us on our workstations? The rise of the high-fidelity performance laboratory. For any investor in the audience, please hire me. This is my dream job. Please let me go explode an oxygenator in a very safe setting, because it's what I'm dying to do. But the open-mindedness and the constrained culture American perfusion is rushing towards, protocolization, disregards the mess that true innovation requires. The intolerance to mistakes and the unacceptable result of a Sentinel event is starving individuals born to push our field forward. We are lacking flexibility, visionary leadership, and a larger percentage of active participants in our industry that are necessary to nurture these individuals and place them in correct environments for broader goals of creating bigger strides. If we were to create a very high fidelity performance lab, we could undertake bigger projects as a community, such as testing cannulas and creating mathematical equations that can tell you exactly when the cutoff occurs, depending on the viscosity, hematocrit, and temperature you're going to use on that patient. Furthermore, you could create that test in that high performance laboratory and also gather data from the patients that tell you how large the diameter of the vessel you're going to cannulate is and how long it is. And if you could do that, your performance laboratory could create a much more accurate performance graph for your cannulas. You could also test oxygenators for the highest pressure before you have a blowout in your line, and at what point in that line that occurs. Is it closer to the patient? Is it closer to your circuit? What happens to it when it does blow out? Can you reattach it? Can you not? So there's a lot of things that can be done with a high fidelity performance laboratory. And we have these for perfusion schools, but we don't have them as an industry. And sometimes industry can't create those laboratories because they lack the correct perfusionists to go work in those labs and have access to multiple devices across different companies. And now we go deeper down the rabbit hole. In New Mexico, there is a critical care doctor named Dr. John Marinero, who currently provides resuscitative ECMO in an ambulance. He uses a hand crank. Don't even look at me that way. I know. I said the same thing to him at AMSECT. But they have a specified ambulance to do this. And when they get a specific patient population called in to EMS, they will go pick up Dr. John Marinero and his ECMO specialist, and they will go to the site and they will cannulate that patient on ECMO and bring them back to the hospital. A lot of the data sets that we have today tell us that time to circulation is the most important for neurologic function in eCPR. Well, ECMO provides 3 to 4 times more oxygen to the brain than normal CPR does on a Lucas device. And 85% of people who die from cardiac arrest die for neurologic reasons. He believes that if he could beat that percentage by 20%, then he can improve the number of patients saved greatly. With that, tomorrow we will have a device that can cannulate ECMOs alone. I call it Robotlet after Robert Bartlett, the godfather of ECMO. This is not so far-fetched. There is currently a student, Ruben Brewer, who is a PhD in mechanical engineering at Salisbury Robotics. He is funded by Intuitive Surgical, who runs those robots that we use for mini invasive procedures. And he has created a robot that can place an IV catheter on its own. So what if we had a device and we took Ruben Brewer and his brilliant mind and his dissertation, and 50 years down the road, we have a device that's easy enough for a paramedic to turn on and allow it to cannulate your patient. And you teach a paramedic to become an ECMO specialist who can monitor your patient all the way to the hospital. We will see the rise of emotional processing and language communication data. The one place that technology cannot change, that perfusion is necessary, is that we are human, and humans have emotions, and emotional processing can become important. So these non-technical skills can make a significant difference in true patient outcomes. Your ability to calm your surgeon in the middle of a disaster, your ability to communicate a crisis and fix it, and reassure people in the operating room, your ability to speak up when people are moving too quickly and assess that somebody is behind does in fact save lives. And in aviation, they've created the black box. And in the black box, all they record is data from how they are communicating with one another during a crisis. So is it so far-fetched that perhaps 50 years from now, perfusionists in the operating room will have a black box available? And when you go back and you look at a case, not only will you have patient data inputs, but you will also have the communication that occurred to determine if communication was the true root cause of the error. We see the rise of an international equipment allocation database. Cambridge currently has this, and it works within their network of schools. And any researcher who's doing a project that runs into an equipment deficiency can quickly log in to their database and request that equipment from another center and have it shipped to them so that they can continue their research. People like Bob Groom in Bomet, Kenya, are lacking certain equipment. That equipment that they lack is specific, and it's hard for us to keep track of what he needs and what he doesn't need, and how do we get it to him? So for every perfusionist that currently has a Viper system at their hospital that will no longer be used, Bob has an extreme need for those Viper systems. So rather than send it back to your manufacturer, if there was an allocation database available where we could send him those Vipers, then more of his cases could run venous saturations continuously during bypass. That not only changes how they practice, but it can also become a standard because no longer is an equipment a deficiency in the ability for him to create a safer standard for practice there. The rise of the venous bag reservoir. We already use this today at some places. I see some people shaking their heads. But Robert Bartlett did a presentation at the AACP, and he talked about how The difference between ECMO and the difference between bypass and why you can run ECMO for so much longer is that there is very minimal air interface on ECMO. Well, what if our AI helped us conclude the patients that would probably require longer pump runs? And what if you were skilled enough to employ a venous bag reservoir in those cases rather than an open venous reservoir? And what if the conclusion to that research showed that those patients required less ECMO post-cardiotomy? So in conclusion, we have the clinician of the future along with the profession of the future. And the clinician of the future will have the courage to be human, to ask questions, to go against the grain, to produce results where people may not believe those results are needed, warranted, or feasible. But most importantly, they'll connect to one another and remember that it's not a circuit that we're running, but a patient that we're managing on a device. Thank you so much.